Good Thursday evening. I'm Chance Seals in Washington. Ahead on Scripps News tonight.
Do you believe the border wall works?
No.
The president dumps on border walls as his team plans to build one. Why the reversal? The U.S. ambassador to Mexico during the Trump years is here with reaction tonight. Plus, a major blow for Venezuelans coming to the U.S. Deportations will begin again. What about those just granted expanded protections to stay and work in the U.S.? We're getting answers. Also, from head of the party to holder of the gavel, new reporting that former President Donald Trump may run for a spot on Capitol Hill before running for the White House. Unending flows of migrants crossing the southern border. American cities overwhelmed, demanding action, and now the Biden administration is listening, pulling some serious 180s. The White House cleared the way for some 20 miles of border wall construction in Starr County, Texas, part of an area seeing especially high levels of illegal crossings. This comes as top cabinet officials are spending time in Mexico City exploring ways to stem the surge, and Mexico's president lashing out.
So they are acting very irresponsibly, and they are putting very hard pressure on the president, who will always count on our support. But that authorization for the construction of the wall is a setback, because that doesn't solve the problem.
We'll hear President Biden's own unvarnished thoughts in a moment and explain the implications here. And if all that were not enough, the White House confirmed starting today, it will resume deporting Venezuelan migrants who crossed illegally since the start of August. Most Venezuelans fleeing their homeland have found refuge in nearby countries. Think Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Peru. But hundreds of thousands have made their way across the dangerous Darien Gap, linking Latin to Central America and ultimately to the U.S. For the scope of this, more than 7 million people have fled Venezuela in the past decade or so. Venezuela is mired in crisis economically, politically. Its government suppresses opposition. It can be hard to find food in the country. Venezuelan human rights activists have told Scripps News there's no future for them back home.
In Venezuela, they are not living but surviving. The situation in Venezuela is critical for most of Venezuelan people. So they decide to cross the Darien, they decide to risk their life because still in Venezuela, the situation is so terrible that the chances for them to survive in Venezuela are almost zero. Torture is a state policy in Venezuela. So if you don't like the regime, they are able to put you in jail. And most of the political prisoners, they are subjected to torture.
With the stakes so high, so personal, let's bring in immigration attorney Elaine Wood tonight, also an expert in human rights and international law. Ms. Wood, does this reversal mean people are going to be turned away at the border, or are they going to get to do the thing where you're allowed to plead your case, stay in the U.S. for a few years while that plays out? And by the way, also, does it apply to families?
Excellent. Lots of questions tonight, Chase. Always happy to be here. So first, I'd like to discuss what's happening in Venezuela, right? So we had recently the extended temporary protected status. So that's applying for people who have come before July 31st. And so anyone who's coming after that time is not necessarily eligible for temporary protected status and then having work authorization that goes with that. So people, as you were mentioning before, are perhaps subject to deportation at this time of return to Venezuela because the temporary protected status is only for people prior to July 31st. So this could, in fact, happen for families as well.
I see. Okay. Because usually there's something of carve out for them, especially if you're trying to claim asylum, but it might apply to families. Okay.
Oh, for asylum, sure. Yeah, I was just talking specifically about Venezuelan TPS. Yeah. So as regards asylum, that's a little bit of a separate issue.
Got it. Okay. The Biden administration just approved temporary protected status, TPS, that you're just talking about there. 500,000 Venezuelans will be covered. They were already in the U.S. prior to August. But how are the new arrivals functionally different, I guess? Because if you're sending them back to the same conditions that you deem the others could not possibly go back to, how does that work?
How does it work indeed? So just to clarify there, with asylum, that's a little bit different. I welcome anyone and everyone to come to our firm. At HAYMAN-WOODWARD, I'm happy to talk to anybody to see what their rights are, to see what their eligibility could be for Venezuelans, Syrians, places where there's war in your countries. So what's happening here with the date of July 31st, right? You would wonder, are the human rights crisis in Venezuela improved subsequent to July 31st in a major way? That's up for debate, obviously. So the question of, what's changed substantially that would allow for us to now return Venezuelans in this way. I wouldn't say that there's been major humanitarian improvements in the last couple of months. No.
I see. Not a drastic improvement to where you'd say, okay, it seems all right. If we send you back, you're going to be okay then. So I assume this is going to be challenged in federal court. Everything the administration does that clamps down is challenged in federal court. Do you think it will withstand a challenge?
That's a difficult one. I like to be very optimistic. It's in my nature, but let's be realistic on this one. There's really a lot going on with the government. With Biden, as you were saying before, sort of doing maybe a 180 and having 20 miles of border wall. I don't actually know. I feel like things are not precedent anymore. I think things are happening. Biden sort of has reversed course on some of his earlier claims, and what's happening with protected status for Venezuelans remains to be seen. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the buoys in Texas, and then, that had been appealed, and things are really increasing, I think, in drama as we're nearing the presidential elections.
Immigration attorney Elaine Wood, thank you so much. Speaking of the election, that is the backdrop of all this, and our coverage of the country's migrant crisis is going to continue after the break. We're looking at the Biden administration's decision to buck the party line, greenlight construction of the border wall, change these rules for Venezuelans. We're going one-on-one with former U.S. ambassador to Mexico under then-President Trump. Next.